There is unity in the oppression. There must be absolute unity and determination in the response.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us again on this 31st Unity 4J Vigil for Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning now. My name is Elizabeth Voss. I'm joined by my co-host, Joe Lauria, and some wonderful guests today with us.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. Of course, there's one headline, and that is the indictment under the Espionage Act of Julian Assange, not a completely unexpected occurrence. We knew that they would not be satisfied, the U.S. government, with 5 years in prison, which was the maximum sentence that the initial placeholder indictment held. That was for government intrusion. So they had nowhere else to go, in my view, but to use the Espionage Act. And that's a monumental step that the U.S. government has made that crosses a red line by criminalizing journalism. No U.S. administration has ever indicted a journalist and a publisher on these sections of the Espionage Act, which essentially mean that he's being charged with possessing and disseminating classified information. Never happened before. And we're seeing what John Kiriakou earlier today in a conversation we had on his radio show called a sea change. We've got media all over the place now supporting Assange, alarmed by the implications for the future of American journalism. Even Rachel Maddow has come out in favor of Julian Assange. This is quite extraordinary. So let's introduce the first speaker. It's Margaret Kimberley. We're going to then be followed by John Kiriakou and George Samueli. We're hoping that Dan Ellsberg joins us later. Margaret, what is your reaction and your views about what's happened?
Well, I'm not surprised. I knew they would come up with something far more serious than the initial charge, but still, it's like a gut punch anyway. He is basically being threatened with life imprisonment. And we also had the double whammy of the reopening of this rape investigation, which opens and closes and opens and closes. And of course, at the opportune moment when this charge will bring him renewed attention, then coincidentally, this rape investigation reappears. And the goal of that is quite obvious. It deprives him of support. He's already been vilified. The corporate media, some of whom now want to defend him, were not much help to him in the past year when the Ecuadorians cut off his communication and when the slanders and vilification began. Most of them didn't say anything. They're speaking up now, but I suppose I shouldn't look the gift horse in the mouth, but their behavior has really been very disgraceful. The New York Times, they finally get around to, if you've seen their editorial, they finally defend him and say, this is a great blow against journalism, but they feel compelled to start off their editorial by talking about how horrible he is. And then they feel it's safe to say what a newspaper ought to say. And especially since it's especially disgraceful because the Obama administration, they always refer to this New York Times problem. That is to say that the Times and other outlets used information that WikiLeaks had. And they didn't know how to justify prosecuting Assange without creating a problem for other media, as some of whom were their sources. So, so their editorial was really pitiful. They shouldn't have bothered, in my opinion, if you feel compelled to start out that way. Well, we think he's terrible, but we're going to speak out anyway. The New York Post, in contrast, just defended him, period. They just did it. I don't know if you had a chance to see it. So that's where we are now, and it's all very disturbing. The Amnesty International, I'm not surprised, but I'm disgusted nonetheless that they said he's not a prisoner of conscience. So, but they were sketchy anyway, Amnesty International. They always defended imperialism, in my opinion. So I think now we will see who are his real defenders, who really believe in the right of the public to know, who really believe in the First Amendment in the United States, which Americans go on and on and on about how wonderful it is and how great our country is. We're going to see who's really serious now. And I am judging people. This is a litmus test. How do people respond to this attack, not just on WikiLeaks, not just on Julian, not just on Chelsea Manning, but this attack on journalism? And we can see it's already begun. In France, the government is investigating journalists who have revealed government secrets about Yemen and corruption involving some official. So we can see that Julian's treatment is going to be repeated around the world.
Absolutely. No, it's horrendous what's happening. Joe, I believe you're muted. I'm trying to unmute you right now.
Muted, and all I said was thank you, Margaret, and then John. So John, please give us your views.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll tell you, Joe, I struggled all day today trying to figure out the best way to spin this, the best way I could convince myself that there was good news somewhere in this thing. And having spoken it over with you on my own show earlier today for an hour, there actually may be good news in this. I think that there's a real possibility, for example, that the Justice Department has overstepped. With Julian looking at 175 years, for all practical purposes, that's a death sentence. And I think that the European Court of Human Rights, through precedent, has already said that it will not send accused to the United States to face charges where they face a death sentence. Now, he's not facing execution, and that might be something that has to be argued, but there's a second part to this, and that is that the European Court of Human Rights has denied extradition to the United States to those people who might face solitary confinement. The United Nations, as we all know, has deemed solitary, as it's practiced in the United States, to be a form of torture. And the Court of Human Rights will not send people to the United States to be tortured. And so I think the Justice Department really overstepped. I think that they wanted to charge Julian with as much as they could so that they wouldn't get caught up in that proviso in the extradition agreement that they can't add charges once he's been extradited. So they threw everything at him. In fact, they shouldn't have thrown everything at him. They probably should have backed off a little, because I think that they've given Julian some real weapons to use in his own defense here.
There you go. Welcome. Give us your quick take, and then we're going to open this up for an in-depth discussion.
Well, I do think that the Justice Department's hand may have been forced. I'm just speculating here, But it's clear that the initial indictment that they came up with, which was very cute and trying to avoid the whole First Amendment issues, really wasn't going to fly. I mean, they must have, the judges must have made clear to the British government that this garbage. Oh, you can't hear me? Or you can?
No, it's fine. It was just a second.
Oh, okay. Do I start again or?
No, carry on, please.
Okay. So, so that's why it was, and hence that was the reason for the opening of the Swedish case as a kind of a backup plan. Okay, the Americans have got nothing. I mean, that's indictment with the first indictment about Assange supposedly helping Chelsea Manning to break this password was just so nonsensical, so feeble, that there was nothing much, there was no way the judges were going to sign off on an extradition warrant on that. So they opened up the Swedish case, but even the Swedish case may not be going so well because, you know, this time the Swedish prosecutor has to go through a legal process, which she didn't have to do in the past. Then she could just simply issue an extradition warrant off her own bat. She can't do it now. She actually has to go and persuade the Swedish court to issue an arrest warrant, which may also be dicey. So it may be that the US government's hand was forced and they had to essentially come up with this. And again, it may be that the government said, you can't pull a little stunt on us by issuing an extra charges once he is actually in your hands in Washington, because we had talked about this in the past. Well, can the Americans actually, once they've got him in custody, can they actually issue additional charges that weren't mentioned in the extradition warrant? Now, we were thinking, well, maybe they can. The hell with everything else, but it could be that the British said, no, there's no way that you're going to do this. You tell us now up front what are the charges that he's going to face. So maybe that the US was just simply that its hand was forced. And, I'm generally pessimistic about things, but, I think John may be right that it's hard to see how British courts are going to sign off on this. This is so flagrantly political, so flagrantly punitive against a journalist, a media person, that it's going to be hard for them to sign off on this and just simply pack him off to the US to face 170 years for doing journalism. So, there may be, a kind of a bright side to it. I mean, I wouldn't hold that too much hope, but at least there is that to be considered.
Well, thank you, George. There are two aspects to what we've just heard. One is what you just ended with, that there could be good news to this, or a bright side, and that it would make it harder to extradite Assange from Britain or from Sweden because of the clear implications here about freedom of the press. And we see this reaction in the media in the US, the New York Post, for example, Mado, Guardian, all these enemies of Assange and the corporate media suddenly are backing him because they see their own self-interest here. And the other aspect are the details of the indictment itself. George, you said they had nothing in the first indictment on the computer intrusion. I still think they have nothing. So we can go into details about the indictment itself. But let's open this up now to, if we can, the discussion of the reaction to this. Because as John said, when I was on a show earlier, we just sort of were feeling our way through this, and it became evident by the end of our conversation, over an hour, that this might actually be a good thing, that they overstepped, that they're getting a kind of support Assange never saw before, and that the public opinion and the media could have an effect even on the British government, whatever government we're going to have maybe in the next year. That's another aspect we have to talk about here. If there is a general election and there's an election of the Labour government, Jeremy Corbyn has been on record saying that Britain should not extradite Assange. He hasn't said much else, but he has said that. So let's open this up for that aspect of it, and then I'd like to talk, if we can, later about the details of the indictment. And Elizabeth, please jump in and unmute yourself when you can as well.
Yeah, hi, and we've also just been joined by Lee Stranahan, who is currently muted, but welcome, Lee. And I completely agree with what you said, Joe, what John had to say, and George. I think that in some sense it is, beneficial that this has gone so extreme that, and Caitlin Johnstone wrote a really brilliant piece on this over 24 hours. where she basically said that this act by the Trump administration has put every single journalist that maybe a week ago was continuing to, basically mock and hate Assange, it's put it on them on his side. And I think that's unprecedented, just as the actual charges themselves are unprecedented. So I think that is the one hopeful takeaway from this situation, which is generally overall not a good one. Eileen, welcome. What are your thoughts on these events?
Well, it's interesting being here in London right now and just trying to forgive me for adjusting myself in the hotel room. I'm in a very small room. But look, it's a horrible situation. And I think one of the things for a lot of people who are on this call in particular and who've been involved in the Unity for J things has been this sense of inevitability. We've been right the whole time. Right? I mean, we've been the ones saying this is what was happening, and the mainstream media ignored that, and the crazy people like the QAnon people have been going, no, he's perfectly safe, and the resistance people have been going, okay, well, screw him, basically. Now you've got the interesting situation of people like Rachel Maddow, Chris Hedges, the New York Times coming out and going, oh, hey, maybe this is a First Amendment problem. And no Republicans, interestingly enough, I'm not talking about the pundits, because as Susie Dawson pointed out, there's a few of us like me, Cassandra Fairbanks, who've been on these things, who supported Trump in 2016. I stopped supporting him at the point he got taken out of the Ecuadorian embassy. And I was on record, I think, on one of these Unity for J podcasts. And I said that, as has every single Trump supporter, by the way. And what was interesting is the attacks you guys were getting for even having the like of, me and my ilk on here has turned out that we're actually people with principles. And I know that's shocking to some people who don't like to think that about people who are on the other side of the, quote unquote aisle. But I think it just exposes how much this left-right divide is a puppet show. There's nothing else. It's a puppet show. And it's designed to distract. But to me, the big interesting thing was the media reaction. I did not honestly expect that. I really didn't. I'll stop talking.
You're absolutely right. We were right all along. I love that line. We got to keep drumming on that one, because now they're all going to, push us aside as if they've been saying this all along, the major media. We're not significant. But we've been here saying that this could happen with the Espionage Act. We were saying he could be arrested, that they would lift asylum, and we were right all along. Please, anybody, feel free to jump in now.
Well, Julian Assange has been right all along. Remember, he said right from the start, from 2010 on, the Americans are going to indict me. The Americans are going to basically send me away for life. In fact, if not even seek the death sentence. And he was mocked repeatedly throughout the media. No evidence for any of this. No evidence for your claims. This is all his paranoia. And therefore, the Americans have, there's no indictment. He's free to leave the Ecuadorian embassy anytime he wants. And it's just because he's basically a bomb and a freeloader and a self-dramatist, that he doesn't leave the Ecuadorian embassy. And this was said repeatedly, particularly, The Guardian, which benefited so much from him. And he's the one who's been proven right. I mean, spectacularly so. I mean, it's just astonishing. He was absolutely right. Yeah, the Americans had been planning this for years and years. They've been working on this indictment. And incidentally, I'm not even sure that there won't be a superseding indictment raising other issues between now and June, whatever it is, when the extradition hearing is set to take place.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Margaret, what's your response on this? I'm getting a little bit of feedback, by the way. Thank you.
Okay. I'm looking for anything hopeful. So I'm glad to hear these viewpoints from others. all along, as Julian has been dragged through the mud, he's not had many defenders, but it's good that people now have to pick a side. I suppose that's the way to put it. It's no longer a hypothetical. It's no longer what if the government might do this or might do that or charge him with this or charge him with that. Now they've shown their hand, and people have to state. The pundits have to state. The newspapers have to state what their opinion is. What side are they on here? Are they on the side of the First Amendment that Americans brag about so much, or aren't they? So far, politicians, as far as I know, Senator Ron Wyden, a Democrat, is the only one who has criticized the charge. The rest of them have been silent. Hopefully that will change. We'll have to drag some of them kicking and screaming, I think, into this. But I think that is the positive thing about it. There's no more guessing, no more what if this, if that. He has been charged with the Espionage Act for being a journalist, for doing the work of journalism. And Chelsea Manning is in jail and being fined every day that she is in jail for refusing to testify and assisting the government here. So now it's put up or shut up time. And all these people who are interested parties have to tell us where they stand. To say we're all Julian is no slogan. It's no tagline. We are. This is... I think they're showing us how they're going to treat people who dissent. And Americans don't think of themselves as being dissenters because most people still think we have a great democracy. But those of us in the alternative media, those of us who protest the policies of the state are now in serious trouble. And all of us should see ourselves in Julian Assange. And we should all assume that at some point the state will find a way to come after all of us.
John, let's talk for a second about the details of this indictment. To me, it's basically an criminalization of fundamental journalistic practices, such as encouraging your source to give you more information and trying to protect the identity of that source if he or she can get into trouble for giving you that information. I point to an article that Robert Perry, the late founder of Consorted News, wrote in December of 2010, 1 month after we learned that the Obama Department of Justice was beginning this investigation of Assange, which has now resulted 9 years later in this indictment. And Bob wrote that he, as one of the best investigative journalists of his era, having unveiled the Iran-Contra scandal, most of the details of that, Bob wrote that he always encouraged his sources to give more, and that he often even told them to break the law if necessary to reveal, to expose a greater crime. And this, of course, is what Assange did. He revealed the crimes of America in Iraq, for example, as a war crime. So and the other thing that Bob said he did was to do everything he could to protect the identity of that source. If you're going to ask them to break the law, it's pretty incumbent on you as a reporter to make sure nobody finds out that you were the source. And when you read this indictment, all the different sections of the Espionage Act, it's all about getting information, classified information, possessing it, and then disseminating it. And that is indeed on the books in the Espionage Act. It's a terrible law, the Espionage Act. I'm hoping that this might also lead to a court challenge, and that this could be struck. The Congress can strike that out of the law, because in 1961 they amended the act to make it global. Before 1961, Assange could not have been indicted on this because he's not an American citizen. He's not on U.S. territory doing this. But now in 61 they changed it. So the Congress could change it tomorrow and take out these parts that conflict clearly with the spirit, at least, of the First Amendment. And hopefully this will lead to that kind of a challenge. I'm not too optimistic about the court the way it is composed right now. But John, just talk again, if you can, about what the indictment says to you. What are they charging him with? And also what we discussed earlier, you and I and Brian, all this window dressing about the fact that he unveiled these names and they were in danger, although there's no evidence anyone was hurt. There's no law against that as far as we could tell.
That's right. That's actually what bothers me more than anything. So he's been charged with 17 counts of espionage. There are 5 different being the operative word, crimes within the Espionage Act. And he's been charged with an array of these 5 different crimes, 17 counts in total coming from the Espionage Act, in addition to the computer conspiracy charge. The espionage charges with which, or that have been levied against him, are not the most serious charges. These are the ones that call for 10 years incarceration per charge. Others call for 20 years. Still others call for life in prison. So these aren't the most horrible, most serious charges. And when there are multiple charges like that, they're meant to run concurrently in the event of conviction. Okay, so that aside, you and I talked earlier today about window dressing, and this is something that bothers me very, very much. What the government has done in this indictment is they've thrown the kitchen sink at him, and they've included a great deal of information that very simply does not constitute a crime. For example, in the indictment, the Justice Department goes on for many pages talking about the notion that, or the fact that, Julian exposed the identities of what they call sources in the indictment, thus putting them in danger. Now, the reason I'm so upset about that is that there are several things wrong with the accusation. First of all, they weren't sources, not in the legal sense of the word. And we know that because Julian was not charged with violating the Intelligence Identities Protection Act. What these were people who U.S. diplomats or military officials had encountered. They offered up something that was interesting. The recipient of the information put it in official channels and sent it back, and Chelsea Manning eventually sent it to WikiLeaks. So I mentioned to you earlier today, Joe, that in many cases, or at least in all the cases where the document released was a State Department document, this is a situation where a U.S. diplomat met with someone, a foreign national, and reported it back to the State Department and said, I met with so-and-so, parentheses, please protect. Meaning, don't go on the news and say, well, John Smith over in Germany told us X. That's meant to prevent embarrassment. It's meant to prevent this person from being punished at work for speaking out of school. Now, in some cases, this took place in Afghanistan or Iraq, and the person's identity was revealed. That's not optimal, but it's not a crime. Very simply put, it's not a crime. And so, besides the fact, and I'll let you talk about this, Joe, besides the fact that Julian released that information on purpose to give those people a heads up that the Guardian was going to blow their identities, and that way they had a chance to protect themselves. Now, even the Justice Department doesn't say that any of these people had anything happen to them, besides the embarrassment of WikiLeaks acknowledging that they were working with the U.S. government. So what upset me was the Justice Department went on for page after page after page saying that WikiLeaks and Julian had blown the identity of these sources and put these people's lives in danger. First of all, not true. Second of all, not a crime. So the same kind of thing happened to me in my case, where even after I took a plea, I complained to the judge during allocution that, hey, I agreed to take a plea and to allocute, but the Justice Department put all of this in some cases unnecessary, in other cases untrue detail in the charge, it's just not fair. I'm being accused of things that I don't have the opportunity to defend myself for. And the judge said, and this is the same judge that Julian will have, the judge said that I should just ignore it because it was window dressing, and that's just what the government does. That's what the Justice Department does. They just throw the kitchen sink at you. Well, where's the justice in that? That's not fair. That's what they've done to Julian in this indictment. So read this indictment with more than a grain of salt. A lot of this stuff is either untrue, unproven, unprovable, or irrelevant.
Thanks, Sean.
Absolutely.
Lee, go on.
Yeah, can I mention one thing about this indictment also? It's very interesting because there's an underlying theory to this indictment. And this theory has a history, and it goes back to Mike Pompeo, who called WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence service, basically. And that phrase was actually used in a 2017 bill that was passed right before the summer recess, where they called WikiLeaks a non-state hostile intelligence actor. And what you're looking at in this indictment is they're very clear. They tried to, using legalese, they tried to make Julian Assange not be a journalist, but they try to make him a non-state intelligence. Now, no one's explained what the hell a non-state intelligence, hostile intelligence service is. I'm not sure what that is exactly. It's a thing Mike Pompeo made up. But the whole legal theory that this is premised on is that Assange is not a journalist, but it's this thing. And that's why this is why Assange, and a lot of people have been seeing this coming for a long time. It's not that we're like psychic or anything like that. We can read. And we know that when Pompeo says that, and when the Senate passes that, and once again, the only guy who did not on Senate Intel who didn't vote for that was Ron Wyden, who's the same guy today coming out and saying, hey, maybe we need to slow down on this. There's an operative theory that's very dangerous, which is the United States could apparently redefine journalist as hostile non-state intelligence. Is CNN a hostile non-state intelligence service? I know many of my former colleagues at Breitbart would certainly think so, right? But that's not a governing principle. That's not at all a governing principle. That's a way to sneak around governing principles. So I just want to mention that because the indictment is actually a summation of what we can call the Pompeo principle here, which is defining WikiLeaks. And this is why Mike Pompeo, I have always been against Pompeo. He is one of the most dangerous guys in the administration, period. And by the way, he's also dangerous to Trump because he's a guy, if Brennan had it out for Trump, you'd think when Mike Pompeo was in charge of the agency, he could have brought some of that to light. So I'm not trying to get too much sympathy for Trump here because I'm not in that mood. But I got to point out that Mike Pompeo, I don't believe is any friend of Donald Trump's at all either. So
well, we remember him laughing about the CIA, lying, cheating, and stealing. That was just a few weeks ago that video was really popularized on social media, but it's definitely not somebody who you want to borrow ideas from in deciding who's a journalist and who's an enemy of the state, essentially.
I see Pompeo's fingerprints all over this indictment. He was the CIA director. I bet when they were writing this thing, I don't doubt that Gina Haspel's happy with this indictment as well. But he's the very first paragraph or two of the indictment, quote Assange saying that we are a people's intelligence agency. Now, I mean, he didn't really mean they were an intelligence agency. That was clearly a turn of phrase he was making to say we're on the side of the people against the state right now. And we're going to get the intelligence, which is what a journalist does, by the way. We are seeking information. The difference between a journalist and an intelligence agent is with the information we receive, we make public. We want to tell people. Intelligence people keep it secret, only for the use of the state. So what he was saying was, yeah, we're acting like a journalist, i.e. an intelligence agent, but we're doing it for the people. We're going to make it public for them. And I think I really see Pompeo's hands on this. And I agree with Lee that he's a dangerous, very dangerous guy. Somebody else, please jump in.
What was interesting about that is that in that indictment, it states that Julian Assange had made it clear that he's seeking information about CIA interrogation methods. So in other words, he's actually saying, yeah, what I want to do, I want to find out about torture. Well, why is he doing that? Well, how about because he thinks people should know about the torture that is being perpetrated by representatives of the government. And I agree with what John says, is that I don't see anything wrong with revealing these pieces of information. It's not as though the names that we're talking about or these were Russian, double agents working for Putin, but secretly working for us. That's not what he was doing. He was saying exactly what John said. These were just sources of information that the U.S. government made use of. So I see nothing whatsoever wrong with the publication of these names. And moreover, we've been through all this during the Manning trial. And in the Manning trial, the U.S. government had its best shot at demonstrating that some of his disclosures had endangered the lives of people who were working for the Americans, the people who had risked their lives to help the Americans. They failed to do it. They failed to show that any of Manning's disclosures threatened anybody's life. So for them to trot this out now and to bring up nonsense about bin Laden, I mean, it really is pathetic.
John Demers, who is the head of the National Security Division of the Department of Justice, who announced this indictment in his press conference, pointed out that Assange is not a journalist because he revealed these names. Journalists wouldn't do that. This is complete nonsense. First of all, it's people we want to define journalism is the government. We are supposed to have adversarial relationship with them. They're not to define who and who is not a journalist or what journalism is. And so that's very, very troubling, just that the government is trying to say who a journalist is and who is not a journalist. And basically, someone who reveals the crimes and the corruption that they're committing is not a journalist in their view, because they're doing their job and they're the enemy.
Well, I also think the non-journalists are revealing themselves. We are seeing who really cares about the profession, who's just a well-paid newsreader, and who is really going to defend the people's right to know. I also think, I hope that this is an opportunity for people in this country and around the world to see how the American criminal justice system really works. This is the country with more people in prison than any other country, with the greater percentage of its citizens behind bars. And one of the ways they do this is by throwing the book at people, overcharging people, basically making up stuff, breaking the law. And people are whose names we rarely hear because it's usually just a criminal case, but people who are forced to plead guilty when they're innocent because they dare not, and wisely, take the chance of trying to defend themselves in court and facing a stiff prison sentence should they lose. And I hope this is an opportunity to talk not just about Julian and Chelsea Manning, but to see how this case symbolizes the way the court system really works in this country, and how cruel it is and how vindictive it is. And perhaps this can lead to discussion about how to change it, or even just for now to name it and talk about the great injustices that many ordinary people experience in this country.
You mentioned Chelsea Manning. Why is she still in jail now? The indictment has come out, the superseding indictment, that they needed her testimony for. The only possible reason that they still want to talk to her, if the grand jury is still impaneled after this indictment, is to try to find out what she's going to say if there's ever is a trial, or to use her testimony against Assange later on, which they cannot do in a grand jury proceeding. That's not the purpose of a grand jury. John, you are very familiar with the justice system, maybe way too familiar for your own liking. Could you weigh in on what Margaret just said? And unmute yourself, of course. Unmute.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, I think they're going to be problems. Chelsea, where do I even start? Chelsea, I think, did a very heroic thing first off the bat by refusing to testify before the grand jury. Certainly a lot tougher than 99% of the people that I know. I'm not sure what effect, if any, that'll have on the case against Julian, because presumably everything that the government wanted Chelsea to say, she already said in her own trial back in 2012. And the reason I think that it won't have any effect on the prosecution is that the judge won't let it have any effect on the prosecution. At the risk of repeating myself, I'm going to repeat myself. And I'm going to talk for a minute about the Eastern District of Virginia and Judge Brinkema. This is Leonie Brinkema. Leonie Brinkema is a Ronald Reagan appointee to the federal bench. She was elevated by Bill Clinton. She has a reputation as being a hanging judge. And I don't say that just because she was my judge. I say that because nobody ever wins in her courtroom, ever. You know, she has this habit, too, of passing down sentence and then looking at you almost mockingly and saying, that sentence is fair and appropriate. When I was sentenced, there were at least 35 people ahead of me to be sentenced. What they do is they say you have to show up 11 o'clock on Thursday for sentencing. Well, they tell everybody to show up at 11 o'clock on Thursday. And so it's you and 35 other people, almost all of whom are there on drug charges. So I was last to be sentenced on purpose because the media was there. And I watched her ruin the lives of 35 families in front of me. Almost all of these people that she sentenced were undocumented immigrants. And so what she did was she sentenced them to hefty sentences for having a little bit of weed at the Iwo Jima Memorial, getting caught in a stolen car crossing a state line. So she was handing out sentences of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years to be followed by deportation. Well, all of these guys were there with their families, and their wives are crying and their kids are crying, and they're clinging on to their dads as the bailiffs are pulling them away and cuffing them and then taking them into the holding cell down in the basement. I watched her ruin every one of those lives. And with every single one of those sentences, she looked at those families as they were screaming, recognizing this was the end of their family. She looked at each one of them and said, that sentence is fair and appropriate. And that's exactly what she said to me when it was all done. That it was fair and appropriate that I was going to prison. Now, I had an odd case. It was something called an 11C1C plea, which meant that it was written in stone and she couldn't change it. So my attorneys had agreed with the prosecution that I would plead guilty in exchange for 2.5 years. The judge wanted 10 years. And so she said that if she could have, she would have given me 10 years, that this was the first time she had had a plea like this in all of her years as a judge. She was appointed in 1986. She said, I don't like it. I don't like it one bit, but it is fair and appropriate that you, sir, are going to prison. Well, I can just see her hand down a sentence of 99 years to Julian, and then with that little smirk on her face, tell him that it's fair and appropriate. That's the way she does. You know, Joe, we were talking. You and I were talking earlier today on my show, and before the show started about different scenarios. And I think that there are so many different possible scenarios that it's impossible for us to sit here and be confident in how we think this is going to play out. I think that Julian really has more going for him right now than we realize. First of all, I'm confident in his legal representation. I'm also confident with the notion that once he gets to the United States, if he gets to the United States, there's going to be a parade of some of the best attorneys in Washington lining up to defend him, probably pro bono. And I'll tell you right now, I am thrilled to introduce him to my own lawyers, most of whom were pro bono and who the Washington Post called legal titans in criminal defense. So I feel like Julian's going to be in good hands. As tough as the courtroom would be if he gets here and appears before Leonie Brinkema, I think he's going to be okay.
John, let me ask you about Chelsea.
Yeah.
First of all, the indictment is a lot about her as well.
Yes.
And
yes, a lot.
It portrays her as someone who's merely a source at Assange's behest, that she wouldn't have done this without Assange encouraging her to break the law by revealing this information. Now, she issued a statement, and she said this after the indictment: "I continue to accept full and sole responsibility for those disclosures in 2010. It's telling that the government appears to have already obtained this indictment before my contempt hearing last week. This administration describes the press as the opposition party and an enemy of the people. Today, they use the law as a sword and have shown their willingness to bring the full power of the state against the very institution intended to shield us from such excesses." Now, the indictment also says that she had legal access to the computers in connection with her duties as an intelligence analyst. And then it goes on to say that they admit that they didn't succeed in getting this password, but it says had Manning retrieved the full hash password and had Assange and Manning successfully cracked it, Manning may have been able to log onto computers under a username that did not belong to her. Such a measure would have made it more difficult for investigators to identify Manning as the source of the disclosures of classified information. Here, the government is exactly admitting that Assange was only practicing journalism by trying to protect her identity. This was all about her identity. They're admitting that in this indictment. Now, what I want to ask you, John, is what happens to her now? The indictments come out. Why is she still in jail?
I think frankly, she's still in jail just because this is how they plan to screw her. Because she refuses to testify, she can sit there on a contempt of court charge until the end of this grand jury. It seems like the grand jury's over unless there really is another superseding indictment on the way. In which case she'll have to sit there until the grand jury is actually done. But I don't think that's the case. I think they're dragging their feet in letting her go. I want to make a point too, Joe. You are exactly correct that they have essentially admitted that Julian is a journalist and a publisher. They've also offered literally zero evidence to indicate that it was Julian that tasked Chelsea Manning with stealing this information and bringing it out. That never happened. Nobody's ever accused Julian of tasking Chelsea Manning. We know the whole Chelsea story. Chelsea downloaded the information, sent it to a middleman who ratted her out, but not before she had sent it on to Julian. And sure, there was conversation back and forth. As you said, it was Julian doing what any other journalist in America would do, tasking Chelsea with clarifying information or additional information. But there's literally no evidence whatsoever to indicate that Julian had tasked Chelsea.
Well, they tried to say that they tried to point out that Assange had, and WikiLeaks had published a wish list of things they'd like sources to come forward and give them. And there's about 99 things on that list. And Chelsea provided 4 of them. I can't remember now who it is, but a lawyer, someone said that I think he may have been her lawyer during her trial, her court martial. said that she's a pretty lousy employee of WikiLeaks if she only came up with 4 out of the 99 things they were seeking.
Yeah, 4%.
Almost 4%, yes.
Yeah, agreed. And that's why the more I play over this in my own head, the more I realize that this case isn't all that it's cracked up to be. You know, it's so easy for us, even those of us who know from experience that the government throws everything into these indictments. When you read the indictment, you know, your initial reaction is to say, oh my God, look at all this information, until you really start thinking about it. And then you realize, no, this really is what Judge Brigham called window dressing. There's nothing here. There are a lot of accusations, but there's a big difference between accusing somebody of something and proving it.
Yeah, Robert Mueller should understand that. And so should the entire corporate media. Keep saying that Russia gave the emails to WikiLeaks. That's never been proven in court and never will be, because those GRU agents will never get inside Brinkman's courtroom, fortunately. Please, everybody, just join in. This is a free-for-all. Go ahead.
I feel bad about the what's going on with Chelsea Manning. To me, it seems fairly obvious that just about every constitutional provision is being violated in this treatment. I mean, I don't see how we're not violating habeas corpus by imprisoning her indefinitely. We're not violating the amendment against cruel and unusual punishment, the 8th Amendment. There's the 5th, the 6th, and the 14th Amendments, all of which are being violated. She's essentially being held, detained indefinitely in order to force her to give evidence that she doesn't want to give. I mean, there's an awful lot of constitutional provisions that are being violated here. I mean, you know, I'm just puzzled that, you know, that there haven't been more constitutional lawyers stepping forth and saying, look, we really have to challenge this.
Well, speaking about people stepping forth, we also had, just as we've been, you know, on this vigil, both Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders have both come out against this these ridiculous charges against Assange. Tulsi was much more vocal about it than Bernie Sanders was, but still, that's adding to all of the hundreds of statements yesterday, including, obviously, as we talked about earlier, Matt Ellis.
What did Bernie Sanders say? Because we've all been waiting for Sanders to say something. What did he say? Do you have his?
Yeah, I can bring that up in just a second, but let me just go back to my Twitter feed. I don't have it in front of me this minute, but we also had, and in it just while I pull that up, we also had a letter published by independent UK journalist Gordon Dimmock that was sent to him by Assange from Belmarsh prison. And at the end of this vigil, we'll be playing Gordon's video on that. And at some point during this vigil, I'd like to screen share that entire letter. You can see it in his handwriting and everything. So we'll do that too. So Tulsi said, quote, charging Assange under the Espionage Act will have serious chilling effect on our most fundamental rights of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Every American, certainly every journalist, must strongly condemn this anti-democratic act by the Trump administration. I don't know if any of you have responses specifically to that, but I will be bringing up the Bernie Sanders tweet in just a second. So. One moment. Okay.
I have it. I'm looking at it, if you don't mind me reading it.
Yeah. Why don't you go right ahead? I just got it.
This is Bernie's tweet. He says, quote, "Let me be clear. It is a disturbing attack on the First Amendment for the Trump administration to decide who is or is not a reporter for the purposes of a criminal prosecution. Donald Trump must obey the Constitution, which protects the publication of news about our government," unquote. And he said that 38 minutes ago.
Very, very good to hear Bernie Sanders state that. I think it is a relatively weak statement, but I don't know. Do any of you have responses to that?
Just in time for our vigil, Sanders. He must have known.
And Tulsi too, both within the last half hour.
Yeah, well, thank you, Tulsi and Bernie. I'd like to know if anybody else made any comments like that, because, I mean, I want to pull up with the Rachel Maddow. That's going to take me a few seconds. What she said, because Caitlin Johnstone, who might join us later, said in her column today, I mean, that Maddow has come around to suddenly understanding the whole story.
Yeah, Caitlin does a really great job quoting her. So if you just pull up Caitlin's piece,
Yeah.
she quotes the significant portions.
I mean,
sure.
She should have defended Assange all along. And basically, liberals like Maddow have to now decide who do they hate more, Assange or Trump. And I think it's Trump in the end of the day, because they think Assange gave us Trump, which is nonsense. They just completely cut out Hillary Clinton's part in that whole election. And so now it's obvious that Trump's always been their target. And now it's a legitimate target because he is ultimately responsible for this indictment, despite what I said about Pompeo being all over it and the Justice Department. That would have been under Sessions, too. That probably he may have had a hand in this at one point because this thing has been going on for a while. But look, before somebody jump in, because I'm going to look for Rachel's.
Well, I didn't watch the Maddow show. I don't watch Maddow, but I did read a tweet by Aaron Maté, who appeared to suggest that what Maddow is really saying, that this is all part of a conspiracy by Trump to avoid extradition of Julian Assange. In other words, he deliberately overcharged, came up with this ludicrous indictment in order to force the hand of the British courts and to refuse to extradite Julian Assange. So in other words, it's to, according to his interpretation, anyway, I don't know, his interpretation that she's suggesting that this is all part of a Trump conspiracy precisely in order to avoid bringing Assange over here and putting him on trial over here, because lest he exposed the whole Trump-Russia Assange collusion story. But as I say, I don't know because I never watched the Madhouse, so I don't know whether that's true or not.
I'd like to respond to that very quickly by just saying it's interesting that the conspiracy theories of Rachel Maddow seem to go so far in one direction, they come around to almost joining the QAnon conspiracy theories, because I've heard over the last 24 hours that apparently the Q narrative is now that Assange is somehow in protective custody. So it's almost echoing what Rachel Maddow may have been theorizing. So that's concerning and interesting. But
here's what Maddow had to say. And these new charges are not about stealing classified information or outsmarting computer systems in order to illegally obtain classified information. It's not about that. These new charges are trying to prosecute Assange for publishing that stolen secret material, excuse me, which was obtained by somebody else. That is a whole different kettle of fish than what he was initially charged with. By charging Assange for publishing that stuff that was taken by Manning, by issuing these charges today, the Justice Department has just done something you might have otherwise thought was impossible. The Justice Department today, the Trump administration today, just put every journalistic institution in this country on Julian Assange's side of the ledger, on his side of the fight, which I know is unimaginable, but that is because the government is now trying to assert this brand new right to criminally prosecute people for publishing secret stuff, and newspapers and magazines and investigative journals and all sorts of different entities publish secret stuff all the time. That is the bread and butter of what we do. I would contest only that we bit. I don't know what she's done in that regard as a journalist, but we should invite her on the next Vigil. What do you think? I think she's now got it. She's saying the stuff we've been saying all along. This is her new thing, and to have her on this side, despite what we all may feel about her, is very important. She's listened to. The press is very influential in all of this, as it will be in Britain. The pressure they can bring to bear on the Home Secretary to decide whether or not he should be extradited, if in fact the court even deems him extraditable, maybe a year from now, is the pressure of the press. I remember Dan Ellsberg telling me 10 years ago that when he brought the Pentagon Papers to the Congress for someone to read, nobody wanted to do it. He thought that if the congressmen read it, then the press would report it. It was then he discovered that he had to have it in the press first, and then Congress will react. That Congress sits around waiting to read what's in the papers to decide what's important and what they should do. So this, in the same way, courts also listen to what public opinion says. In the Tom Drake case, Tom, of course, was accused of leaking classified information to the Baltimore Sun. He did not do that. Finally, he was able to get a lot of good pieces by meeting secretly with a lot of the national security reporters in Washington, including Jim Risen. and Ellen Nakashima of the Washington Post was able to get pretty fair articles about what he had done. And he believes that had a big role in the fact that the government lost the case, essentially. He forced them to go to trial, not take a plea, and they had to just reduce it to some misdemeanor when they had accused him under the Espionage Act. Drake won that case partly because of the government's, the press's role in putting pressure. Drake thinks that's the main reason. There were other reasons, but this could also play out for Assange if the media, and now someone of the stature in terms of the reach that she has, of Rachel Maddow taking up Assange's cause, something none of us would ever, I can't believe I'm saying those words. Rachel Maddow has taken up Julian Assange's cause because she thinks we do that every day. Well, okay, we'll let her get away with that because this is really crucial. And I think also in the UK, we should talk a little bit, and George could probably weigh in on this. I think he knows British politics pretty well. Theresa May resigned yesterday. She's leaving on June 7th. There's going to be a new party conservative leader. That person will become immediately the prime minister. That's probably going to be unbelievably Boris Johnson. He's a complete fool. And they usually, when there's a change of leader like that, there's a lot of pressure to put to bear on the party that lost its leader to have a general election. Jeremy Corbyn called for one yesterday. The polls show Labour is in the lead. I think he could beat Johnson. If he wins, he will have a new Home Secretary who probably will not extradite Julian Assange. So we've got all these things happening right now. It's amazing.
Just on that point, there's no obligation on the part of the government to have a general election, and the Tories will almost certainly not call for a general election for another couple of years, because for the obvious reason they're likely to lose it. And so, much as we would like to see Jeremy Corbyn in power, I don't think that's a realistic option for the time being. Because he's not. The Tories just don't move out. They don't want to so they're going to delay the election.
That's correct. We shall see. Probably wouldn't come until October 31, which is the hard deadline on Brexit, whether they have to leave or not, even without a deal. And I want to see Boris Johnson do any better than Theresa May did. But you're right. They don't have to call one. They're going to resist it. But it's often the case that there is a general election even sooner because of public pressure to have one. But let's hope that happens. But it's still part of the positives that we are taken out of this these developments, that this indictment is flimsy, that this indictment is now causing people, even like Rachel Maddow, to come out in defense of Assange, and that could have an enormous role on what the future is. If he's brought here into the court, I think they're going to get him. We have to hope that he's not extradited. And even without a new government in Britain, the British judges and the Home Secretary, will they want to be seen as turning over a man to a country for a purely political prosecution, a clear violation of any standard of press freedom? Do they want to be seen that? How will the British press see them if they do that? Do they want, if this government extradites him, that would hurt them whenever perhaps when there isn't a general election. They're always thinking, of course, of their re-election. So I think we have a lot of reason to be positive right now, George.
I think I'm just wondering now how the Swedish scenario will play out, because the Swedish scenario kind of gets everyone in Britain off the hook, gets the government off the hook, it gets the judicial legal system off the hook.
Well, actually,
and everyone can understand that what we really care about is women and women's rights and sexual violence, and we're on the side of apple pie and puppies and kitten and so on. So I wonder whether the Swedish scenario may not be maybe the way that the British will now want to go.
Yeah, no, actually, it's interesting because I do think that the British would like to have us think that way about their responsibility for his extradition to the US. But as you and I talked about last week, it is actually UK Home Secretary Sajid Javid who is responsible for not only direct extradition to the United States, but also onward extradition from Sweden. Even if he is extradited to Sweden, it is Sajid who has the ultimate responsibility. So it is still the UK who will have its hands dirty if he is extradited to the US. And I hope that a lot of our viewers will reach out to him either through letters, Twitter, social media, whatever, and make him aware that we are watching his decision on this issue, for sure.
Elizabeth, do you know anything about how the Swedish court system will actually work out? I mean, will the Swedish courts just rubber stamp the prosecutor? Do you have any sense of how they're going to go?
Well, I'm not a lawyer and I'm definitely not familiar with the Swedish legal system, but I think that from the history of Sweden basically extraditing, I believe, every request that the US has ever made of them for an extradition, I don't think that we would really have much hope of Sweden refusing to extradite. But then again, as you all have been talking about, these extra charges are so ridiculous and obviously politicized that I think and I hope that it would be much more difficult for them to argue that this is fair or just in any way whatsoever. I think that initial single charge would have been easier for them to extradite Assange under or with. And
don't forget, the Espionage Act does carry the death penalty, but only in the case of a leak happening during wartime. But of course, many of the most important leaks of publications of WikiLeaks were about the Iraq and Afghan war. So it's not, you can't totally dismiss that. And that's important because Sweden would not be able to extradite someone to the US if, in fact, there was a death penalty. Now, the prosecutors can say we're not seeking the death penalty, but it's up to the judge to decide that. And we've just heard a whole bit about that judge from John Kiriakou and how she likes to hand out the harshest sentences. So that probably won't happen, but that could play into the extradition issue, whether it happens or not.
I'm not that hopeful about the British standing up. All of these countries, when it comes down to it, they seem to do what the U.S. wants them to do. I always want to be optimistic about Julian's case, but whatever they may think about the U.S. or Trump in private, they end up going along with because they're a puppet state. Let's just be honest about that when it comes to international affairs. But I just wanted to talk about Rachel Maddow. She's such a loathsome person, but she carries weight. And even though I was just reading her the transcript from her show last night, and even in her condemnation of these charges, it was with all sorts of backhanded remarks. He's spectacularly unsympathetic, and I know you don't like Julian Assange. I don't like him either. That sort of thing. I guess we have to take what we can get. Because there is a segment of the population, these overeducated liberals, who repeat her every word like followers to a cult leader. So it does count for something in his benefit that despite the fact that she feels compelled also to talk about how horrible he was and he helped the Russians and that's why Trump won and all of that stuff, that she does make the right call about the justice or rather the injustice of these charges.
The New York Times editorial, which almost completely supports Assange because of their own self-interest, also says he's not a hero. Well, the guy is a hero, let's face it. He's no matter what we think of him personally, what we know about him, most people don't know anything about him personally. What does Rachel Maddow really know about him? Has she met him? I doubt it. But they have to say he's not a hero, he's awful. If people who are awful, if that was a crime, I mean, there wouldn't be enough room in the jails to put all the people who aren't nice people. That is not a crime, just like not revealing informants' names is not a crime. So
just on a personal level, I have never heard anyone spell out anything that he has done bad personally. I haven't heard him that he's stolen money from anyone. I have not heard that he's plagiarized anyone. I haven't heard that he somehow slept with his best friend's wife or any of these other things. I mean, the worst thing that people have ever said about him is that, he had a couple of affairs, kind of casual sexual affairs when he was in Sweden. Well, I mean, if you're going to, that's the worst thing that you can say about him. And that justifies all these awful personal attacks on him. But I haven't heard, if he's a bit irascible in his personal dealings, well, who wouldn't be, given all that he's gone through? So I haven't even remotely anyone says that he's a bad person.
Well, that's true, but the point is, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant what kind of person he is.
Of course it is.
He's done the best journalistic work in the last decade. He's made a lot of people in the corporate media jealous of him because of that, and he's being charged with encouraging his source to give more information and trying to hide her identity. That's what the indictment says. That's what any journalist does. That's why it's even obvious to Rachel Maddow. And I don't think we can emphasize enough how important it is that there's this tide turning, this sea change, as John called it earlier. It is enormously important because there's a press and a public opinion in Sweden too, by the way. Will the press there, how would they stand for the idea of him being sent to the United States to stand trial for journalistic practices and facing life imprisonment? I don't think they're going to like that either. So this is the keys, and this is what we've been talking about on Unity for J all along. This whole purpose of these vigils, from what I understand, Elizabeth Cattell-Moore, because she was there from the beginning, was to get public support behind Assange. And we knew who knew the day would come, Elizabeth, that Rachel Maddow would be enlisted amongst those people to support Julian Assange publicly. This is what this indictment has done.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think it's shocking. Go ahead, Margaret.
Yeah, only Mike Pompeo could manage that. This is a person who, I mean, others have talked about how dangerous he is, but he's also not very bright. I mean, it's clear to me that those remarks he made a few weeks ago when he talked about how at the CIA they lied, cheated, and stole, that's something an unstable person would say. I mean, first of all, it's not a surprise to anybody who pays attention to these things. We all know that's what intelligence agencies do. But that he's so full of himself that at that moment he would blurt that out in a public event. This is a person who is dangerous for other reasons, and we were seeing it all over the world. This attempt to overthrow the Venezuelan government, which isn't going to happen, or regime change.
I'm not sure if my internet has just kind of gone off the kilter or if we've lost Margaret.
I think we lost Margaret. I can't hear
her.
Okay. And that we've lost the picture as well.
People.
There she comes.
There we are.
Okay. I don't know where you lost me, but then I can't remember the point I was making now. But anyway, yes, I don't have a lot of faith in the British government doing the right thing because they do what the U.S. wants. Sweden, they seem to so far. First, the first investigation is dropped, and then it's reopened, then it's dropped. So I think they are also susceptible to pressure from the U.S. So it seems we're relying on Rachel Maddow to get public support for Julian. But I wanted to touch on something else about people not liking him. And I think it's because of propaganda. We can't miss that point. And I really liked Lisa Johnson, the Australian psychologist, talking about, who's been on Vigils in the past, talking about propaganda and how it sways public opinion and how Assange has been vilified so much and has now been connected with Trump, which makes it difficult, if not impossible, for people who should support him to keep them from supporting him. So all this has taken its toll. And when people feel compelled to say, well, I don't really like him, but I'm going to stand up for the First Amendment, we can't forget that is why. There has been this huge, I'll just call it a psyop, ever since Election Day in November of 2016 against him or anyone else who can be used to attack anyone who can be blamed and cover up for Hillary Clinton and what she and others did to bring about her own defeat.
I was going to ask Joe, what do you think, how do you think it's going to play out on the American political scene? Because today I looked again at that letter sent by those 8 Democratic senators last year. You remember they sent this letter to the Ecuador government demanding that Ecuador do something about Julian Assange, that they got to kick him out of the embassy. I mean, this was the Democrats. This was Dianne Feinstein, that guy in New Jersey, Menendez, you know, all the usual things. So we've had this statement now from Ron Wyden. We had a statement from Bernie Sanders. How do you think the Republicans and the Democrats are going to come out on this, or are they just going to, you know, just run away from it and just wouldn't touch it with a barge pole? What do you think, Joe?
I think they're not going to touch it with a barge pole. I would be very surprised if this became an issue in the presidential elections, for example, in the primaries. I think they'll only talk about it when they're asked, and I don't know how many journalists will ask them, but they might. Now that they're getting it, that Assange is a journalist. That's what Maddow was admitting right now. I don't know if she ever said before. I don't watch her either, George. So I don't know if she's ever previously said he's not a journalist. I wouldn't be surprised if she had, but she's admitting now that he is, and that she likes to include herself by saying, we do this. Well, he does that. He's done that better than anyone, really. And the fact that they now see him as a journalist, maybe we'll hope that journalists will ask the candidates about this issue. It could be some way to batter Trump, because this is the Trump administration that did this. As we've said repeatedly on this vigil, no administration has ever gone this far to prosecute a journalist under those sections of the Espionage Act for possession and dissemination of classified information. The Obama administration, to its credit, stopped short of it because they knew what the repercussions would be. And here's Trump, but I think Pompeo behind this, certainly doing it. They've actually crossed that red line. And it's been such a bombshell that we've gotten people who normally hate Assange to come out in his support. So if journalists see themselves as the target here, as they should, and they're beginning to do, they might make it an issue by asking the candidates about this. I can't be more encouraged, really, by this turn of events, by the across-the-board headlines decrying this indictment and understanding what the consequences are, and therefore all admitting that Assange is, in fact, a journalist, even if they don't want to say he's a hero. He has done journalistic work, and I hope that it becomes an issue politically, but I don't think candidates are going to be on there. You know, I doubt that they would introduce this idea about Assange on their own without being asked. So let's hope that they're asked.
I was wondering whether any of the conservative talking heads on Fox News are going to touch it. I know it's Tucker Carlson didn't touch it yesterday. Maybe he'll touch it today. I don't know. Sean Hannity, you know, he doesn't say anything that's unflattering to Trump. Ingram also never anything that might be unflattering to Trump. So I kind of wonder how that's going to play out. I suspect they just keep their mouth shut.
Well, now we know your viewing habits, George. You say you never watch Maddow, you never watch, but now you're quoting from Fox, so you watch Fox. Chris Hedges has joined us. We're really pleased, Chris, to be with us. Thank you for joining us. We, of course, been talking only about the indictment of Julian Assange under the Espionage Act, so please weigh in, Chris.
Well, this is.
We've had some feedback today. Don't worry about it.
Okay,
Joe,
we all.
Yeah, we're ready.
Yeah, I mean, this is what everybody, Joe, you, and Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, all sorts of people have been saying now for a very long time that the end goal of this is to make it impossible to publish classified information, even even build contacts with people inside the system who would give you classified information that would expose malfeasance, war crimes, fraud, and the lies of empire. I'm just curious at this point what the New York Times ran an editorial, but the media totally dropped the ball on this one, and very naively bought into first the character assassination, secondly the characterization of Julian and WikiLeaks as something other than a publisher or a reputable entity in the world of journalism, and essentially defended their passivity and I would argue complicity by saying, well, look, he's only been charged with attempting to hack into or attempting to assist Chelsea Manning in terms of hacking into a government computer. But I think all of us who followed this closely understood the dire and very dangerous ramifications, which have now, in essence, been made public. This is what it is not, of course, the application of the rule of law. It's the evisceration of the rule of law. Julian Assange is not an American citizen. WikiLeaks is not a U.S.-based publication. And the message is now anyone, anywhere, of any nationality who dares to expose or shine a light into the inner workings of imperial power and the American empire will face extraordinary rendition and life in a supermax prison in Florence, Colorado.
Chris, we're seeing an enormous change in the opinion of the media towards Assange, and we've been talking a lot about Rachel Maddow. I don't know.
I don't watch in on that one.
Nor do I. But fortunately, Katie Johnstone has written a piece about what she had to say last night. And just to summarize, because I was reading about it, reading her words before, she's saying that this is an outrage and that Assange is a journalist and this is what we do for a living and we have to get behind him on this. I mean, she has come out in favor of Assange. Now, she decided she hated Trump more than Assange. Of course, she had to throw in there that he's an odious person and all that, and that's totally irrelevant. But
it's also not true. I mean, this just makes me sick. I mean, Rachel Maddow has never met Julian Assange. How would she know if he's an odious person or not? I mean, I don't think at this point, because publications like the New York Times, the Guardian, and others essentially were complicit in the lynching of Julian Assange. It's late. It's good that they finally woken up, but they should have woken up a long time ago when those of us in the wilderness were, Cassandra-like crying out that this is really the death of investigative journalism, and that's what it is. So I'm glad to see that they recognize the severity of the moment, but they were in essence the prime institutions that were used to demonize and carry out the kind of character assassination that was relentlessly pursued to discredit and isolate Julian Assange and his supporters.
Well, they're jumping on our bandwagon now, and they'll probably brush us aside as insignificant once they pick this up. But this is really important because I think I was saying before how Dan Ellsberg told me 10 years ago that when he went to Congress with Depending on Papers, none of the senators wanted to do it because he'd hoped if they'd read it that the press would report on it. Then he realized that he'd have to go to the press first because Congress doesn't do a damn thing till they read something in the newspaper and realize they have to act. So, and also in the Tom Drake case, the good press that he got towards the end helped him beat the government on that false charge of leaking classified information to the Baltimore Sun. So what role do you think the press, if it in fact finally comes around to supporting Assange, A, as a journalist, B, as innocent, and seeing that this indictment only indicts him for journalism, They say clearly that Chelsea Manning had legal access to the information, and Assange's crimes are encouraging him to give more information to help hide his identity, her identity. That's what it clearly says.
Yeah.
So what role can the press play here and in Britain or in Sweden as well, in putting pressure on those courts not to extradite him, or if he should come here, to help influence the way the government deals with him?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, I think, for instance, the New York Times position was important and useful, but as I argued before, it's very late. And the Times in particular, was one of the journalistic institutions that was used quite effectively to isolate and demonize Assange when those of us who were raising these kinds of issues and issuing these kinds of warnings were being pushed aside. So let's never forget that these institutions are complicit in the state of affairs in which we're in. The other thing that worries me is that the drive to lynch Julian Assange and WikiLeaks is bipartisan. Both the Democratic and the Republican Party establishment are determined to get WikiLeaks. Unlike with the Pentagon Papers, there is not a significant bloc within the Democratic Party. As a matter of fact, I don't even know of any major Democratic elected official who's willing to support Julian Assange. And that's an important difference. And the press is very anemic. The press is very weak. The press has been complicit in bringing us to this moment. It is important, you're right, that they have finally decided to recognize what's at stake here. But our democratic institutions are, anemic or dead, and it's very clear, both within the hierarchy of the Democratic Party and the hierarchy of the Trump administration, that they don't really give a damn what the press says. They're going to try and go ahead for this. So, I mean, for me, I'm going to go to London for the hearing on the 12th and do a bunch of shows, with various people, including George Galloway. Is he on there? I'm trying to get him on my show to raise the issue. And I don't know the British judiciary. I just hope that it has a degree of independence that the American judiciary does not, and can defend the rule of law, which would mean that and Julian, who is not committed a crime, is allowed to go home to Australia.
That would be a great day. Does anyone have something to ask Chris? Elizabeth, Margaret?
Yeah, I was going to ask, why do you think it is that it's just taken this long for the press to realize that they're next after Assange is potentially punished or prosecuted in this way?
Because they refused to acknowledge or accept that there were a series of other indictments that have now been made public under the Espionage Act. And the out that they were offered and that they took was first, of course, you saw with Alex Gibney's film, which was just agitprop for the security and surveillance state, that he was hiding out from prosecutors, Swedish prosecutors, and that's the only reason he was in there. And then the next fallacy was that the United States only wanted to extradite him for the charge of trying to hack into government computers. I mean, anyone who believed that has zero understanding of how angered the deep state was by the revelations that probably the most important journalistic revelations in decades, certainly since the Pentagon Papers, how deeply embarrassed and angered the deep state was and how determined that they were to get Julian. So it's very hard to deny. I mean, it's in black and white now. This is not just an assault against WikiLeaks or Julian Assange, but against the entire press. But again, I have to go back to my other point that the press was a willing partner in the efforts to demonize and isolate Julian Assange and his supporters. when, of course, they should have been more astute and I think understood, number one, was what was at stake here, and number two, what the state decided to do. But now they have no deniability. It's completely out there, and they anyone who reads it understands that noose is not just for Julian and WikiLeaks. It's for anybody who attempts at this point to publish material and information or release documents that the state wants to keep secret.
Yeah, and as a follow-up question to that statement, do you believe that if Assange is prosecuted under these charges, will the New York Times, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, and other outlets that partnered with WikiLeaks to publish the 2010, Cablegate releases and other releases that WikiLeaks published, will they also be prosecuted? Because it really seems like they would be open to that under these charges.
Well, but this now there isn't a legal precedence. I mean, this creates the legal precedence to prosecute them. That's the whole point. And the animosity that the Trump administration, figures like Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, Trump himself, have towards the press is quite public and quite open. And they will use anything they can get their hands on. So I have little to doubt that once this judicial precedence is set, if it is set, I hope it isn't, it will not in any way end with Julian Assange or WikiLeaks.
Chris,
following up on what Joe was saying about there's been a bit of a sea change in the last 24 hours in the way the media are covering Julian Assange, do you think that this will be consistent, or do you think they're going to go back to the smearing exercise of Julian Assange? Because today I came across an article that the New York Times ran on April the 11th, the very day that Julian was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy, an article that was actually saying, well, we still got to really answer this question about Julian Assange's connections with the Russian government and whether he was a Russian agent. So they were saying this after, just a few hours after he was dragged out of the Ecuadorian embassy, that where we still need to answer these questions about his links to the Russian government. So do you think that the New York Times is going to go back to that, the whole Putin, Assange, Trump issue, or are they going to be consistently now fighting on the behalf of Assange and the First Amendment?
No, I think what they'll do, which will be quite crippling, is that they will hold fast to the character assassination which they engaged in. So, as we heard earlier, they will say, well, yes, this is an assault on First Amendment rights, but Julian Assange is an odious tool of Vladimir Putin, which, of course, weakens their case. But I think that's the game they'll play. They will continue to demonize Julian and then say, but this is dangerous for all of us. And it is that demonization, isolation of Julian and WikiLeaks, which has made it so hard for all of us who have been fighting this battle, and to go forward and continue to paint him as an unpleasant or a person without integrity, or a tool of the foreign government, and then say, but is to weaken their own hand. That's what I think is going to happen.
Chris, in the larger issue of the decline, if not demise, of democracy in the U.S., what role does this indictment play? To me, there's a pretense of democracy. And when you put out an indictment like this, you're no longer pretending anymore that we don't have a democracy.
No, that's exactly. They're not pretending. I mean, the Trump administration has stopped pretending that it cares about the rule of law a long time ago. Whether it's Barr and other figures holding Congress in contempt, whether that's the open efforts to obstruct justice, whether that's the interference in the court system. This is just a piece of the entire apparatus that is dismantling what's left of the rule of law in the United States. An important piece, but just a piece.
Because the Obama administration, of course, did not go this far. They wanted to indict him. They paneled the first grand jury. They came right to the edge, and they realized, well, this would criminalize journalism, and we weren't going to get away with this. But
I mean, let's be specific. It would criminalize the New York Times, which was an organ that was, deeply sympathetic to Obama in the same way that it was to Hillary Clinton. And now we have a situation where the White House sees the New York Times as the enemy. I mean, justifiably, the New York Times is vicious in terms of Trump. And so that's the change. The Obama administration realized that if they went this route, there was nothing to stop them or stop anyone from also prosecuting the New York Times, because the New York Times did the same thing. Now you have an administration that hates the New York Times and would love to see it destroyed. And that's why they're going through with it.
But this criminalizes Fox News too, in a way. But
it's like electric, Joe. They pick and choose who they want to attack. So they won't go after Fox News, even if Fox News were to get up there and start reading from highly classified documents night after night, which they won't do. They will use it against their enemies or their perceived enemies.
But does this indictment go too far in creating the backlash against Trump's assault on democracy that will actually win over a good part of the media first and then the public? This may have been a huge mistake on the part of the Trump administration, this indictment.
No, I don't think so. Because name me one Democratic official that's willing to stand up for Julian.
Well, Tulsi Gabbard and Bernie Sanders have both come out with tweets today saying that they decry this indictment. Those are two. I know we want to hear Pelosi and Schumer and those say it, but maybe they will. Yeah. Maybe they will. Maybe because they watched Rachel Maddow.
The Democratic pretty much the Clinton dominated apparatus is as intent on going after Assange as the right wing. And I didn't see those tweets, but you will have a few figures perhaps on the periphery, but the people who hold the reins of power, like Pelosi, aren't. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. I think they blame. I know the Clinton campaign blames WikiLeaks in large part because of the release of the Podesta emails for the loss of the elections. So I think they're pretty intent on vengeance.
Oh, that's probably true. Margaret?
Well, I agree with that assessment. And no, Schumer, Pelosi, that whole crew, the Democratic establishment, I don't believe they would ever speak up for Assange. I think this handful that we've seen, Ron Wyden, Tulsi Gabbard, Bernie Sanders, lame defense, I think that we may get a few more, but I think that will be it. If they defend Assange too much, then they have to backtrack on all the other things they've said about him, about, even Mueller's report, which debunks the collusion, still maintains that WikiLeaks was working with the Russians to undermine the election. And Democrats are still running on that instead of the things they ought to be running on. So I don't think we'll get more than a handful of people, and even the Rachel Maddows of the world, that will, it'll still be the backhanded defense. Well, we think he's terrible, but, we believe in the First Amendment, so we'll hold our nose and support him in this case. I think that's about all we're going to get. And even when they do that, I believe in calling people out. And even though we need, as I was saying before, someone like Rachel Maddow can be helpful to Julian, I think the rest of us should point out how duplicitous they've been and point out the various kinds of corruption that have taken place in the corporate media and their relationship with the state or their relationship with the Democratic Party or Hillary Clinton. We should not, those of us who from the beginning have been clear about where we stand and the importance of defending Julian Assange and now Chelsea Manning, we should not allow these people for this brief moment to give even a tiny bit of defense without us pointing out where they've stood all along.
Well, I think
Yes,
George.
No, it's not. There's also the aspect of it the government is going after WikiLeaks. They're not going after the New York Times. They're not going after the Guardian. They're not going after the Washington Post. And they're going after WikiLeaks for a very good reason, because it's WikiLeaks that has blazed the trail. It's WikiLeaks that has provided this huge, massive information. Everybody else, the New York Times, the mainstream media, they've basically followed the lead of WikiLeaks. So what do? You take out the leader. Once you take out WikiLeaks, well, that's pretty much the end for whistleblowing. I mean, that's pretty much the end for revelations of classified information, because who's going to dare to do this if they're facing 170 years behind bars? So there's no need to go after the New York Times. So in a sense, like the government is right to say to the New York Times, you're not really in any danger. We're not going after you. We're going after WikiLeaks, because WikiLeaks is the problem. They're the ones who have provided all this classified information to the public. If we take them out, we take out the whistleblowers, and basically then there'll be no more news, and the New York Times can go back to writing whatever trivia that he wants to write about. So the government can focus very narrowly on WikiLeaks without necessarily threatening the New York Times.
Let me put me in the uncomfortable position of defending the New York Times, where I worked for 15 years. And I could spend the next hour giving you a pretty savage critique of it. However, there have been leaks within the deep state that have embarrassed and angered the Trump administration, and I don't think they would stop. I mean, you're right that this is a way to intimidate the Times. And the question is, would that intimidation then be so intense that the Times would just stop trying to publish anything? I don't know coming out of the paper, but I know that, I firmly believe that the Trump administration has no intention of stopping with WikiLeaks, that WikiLeaks then gives them a legal precedence or kind of legal sledgehammer to go after media organizations like the Times that deeply angers the Trump White House. You're certainly right that WikiLeaks was the leader, that WikiLeaks provided information to the public on a scale and with a depth that no news organization, including the New York Times, has matched in decades. But the Trump administration has an extremely thin skin, and the Times, let's say all this goes through, and let's hope it doesn't. But if they're successful in sentencing WikiLeaks and Julian, then I have no doubt that they would attempt to then turn on the Times and organizations like that. He hates the Trump administration. They hate the Washington Post. They hate the New York Times. They hate CNN. And this gives them a legal device to cripple, if not destroy them.
Therefore, the Washington Post and the New York Times and CNN will be most likely defending Assange, because they're defending themselves by doing that. To ask you about, are you still there? Can I ask you, Chelsea Manning, now, this indictment, is there still, is the grand jury still sitting? Why do they still need her in jail?
Well, we know why. They want to pressure her to claim that Julian was complicit in attempting to hack into a government computer. And so far, she has courageously refused to lie on their behalf. But that's why she's going to. I mean, that's been going on since she was in trial for me.
But the grand jury has returned this indictment already. What do they need her to say this for again? They're already saying that she did that. We have
because the case is weak. The case is really legally, it's really weak.
Well, that's true. But are they going to try to get her to testify to use stuff in a possible trial, not for another indictment, which I don't believe they're allowed to do in a grand jury?
I think that's what they want.
But that's not correct legally, is it? To use a grand jury proceeding
let's go all the way back to the beginning. And it's everything they're doing to Julian's not correct legally, and the guy never committed a crime. I mean, it's Kafka now.
We are at that stage, aren't we? It's look, going back what Margaret said, she's left us now, but about, I want to keep harping on Maddow, but I'm a little shocked that she said what she'd said yesterday, saying, quote, these charges are not about stealing classified information or outsmarting computer systems in order to illegally obtain classified information. It's not about that. These charges are trying to prosecute Assange for publishing that stolen secret material, which was obtained by somebody else. That's a whole different kettle of fish. And she eventually says the Justice Department today put every journalistic institution in this country on Julian Assange's side of the ledger, on his side of the fight, which I know is unimaginable, but that is because the government is now trying to assert this brand new right to criminally prosecute people for publishing secret stuff. And newspapers and magazines and investigative journals, all sorts of different entities, publish secret stuff all the time. That's the bread and butter of what we do. I contested her use of the word we in that. But
yeah, but let's be clear. First of all, the New York Times already came out, in essence, saying that. So it's a pretty mainstream and safe position. Number two, Rachel Maddow just spent the last 2 years shredding her journalistic credibility by propagating these conspiracy theories about Russiagate. This is probably an attempt to regain some kind of journalistic
credibility,
or that she's eviscerated. So, and it's not a particularly courageous position if the New York Times wrote it. What's that?
No, that's true.
Yeah.
However, I would call her the chief propagandist of the Democratic Party, and you might. So I think the politicians read the papers and listen to Rachel Maddow, because people who vote for them listen to her. So you would hope that she'd have some influence on them in this case.
We'll see. I think I think again, as Margaret pointed out, the hierarchy of the Democratic Party really believes that WikiLeaks cost them the election, and they want revenge, and that will take precedence over anything the New York Times or Rachel Maddow says.
Now, what effect do you think the indictment might have on the British system, courts, and then ultimately the Home Secretary?
I don't know because I don't know the British system, judiciary that well. That's part of the reason I'm going to London, because I want to find out. Yeah, but my impression is that there is more independence within the British judiciary than there is in the American system. But that's an impression. It could be wrong.
Well, would they be affected by this view that this is an indictment against journalism, and that the courts in Britain and the Home Secretary would not want to send a man back to the U.S. for a clearly politically motivated indictment that indicts journalism? They would have.
The only thing I would say,
no, I don't know exactly.
I don't know. But secondly, let's remember that the press laws in Britain are far stricter and confining than they are in the United States.
That's true. They really have an Official Secrets Act, but we just have Section E of the Espionage Act, which is pretty damn close. Peter B. Collins is joining us as well. Chris, it'd be great if you. Okay. Thanks so much for your time. It was excellent to hear from you.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.
Yes. Bye.
I've got to sign off. I'm going on a video call here. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
See you next time, Peter. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, Joe. Hi. I'm sorry. I'm juggling many things at one moment.
So you're with us now.
I am with you.
Well, Peter, you got the floor to tell us what you think about this indictment.
Well, number one, my primary point is that Chelsea Manning needs to be released forthwith. The issues of the Espionage Act, there's a whole lot to discuss, but fundamentally, there is no visible purpose to keeping her locked up behind these phony contempt charges. And so that's my first comment. Secondly, it is remarkable to see the corporate media aroused from its slumber they took the bait that the indictment that was revealed on the single charge back in April was the defining charge. And many people on this video vigil and other smart people, I'll credit Kevin Gostola, saw through it immediately, that the elements of the Espionage Act were included in that single charge. And so it is disturbing but not shocking to see this development. What is remarkable, and here I'll credit Caitlin Johnstone for her offshore prescience. She must stay up all night watching American cable TV shows. But her commentary today regarding Rachel Maddow, I think, is very strong. And it shows that the corporate media is now responding out of self-interest and not based on principle. And they do recognize that these new charges threaten their practice of journalism, even if they don't wish to grant Mr. Assange status as a journalist. And so, I think that overall, that is a positive development, because seeing them go soft on Assange, go soft on the cause of press freedom, on the right to protect confidential sources, has been quite alarming. And I'll just add one more point that's kind of provincial. Here in San Francisco, we have a controversy that surfaced 2 weeks ago today when the cops raided the home of a freelance journalist. They were trying to track down a leak in their own department of a sensitive document related to the death of our public defender. And they now admit that going to his home with battering rams and sledgehammers were bad optics. But mostly I want to single out the San Francisco Chronicle, which is taking a firm stand for the First Amendment and the rights of Brian Carmody, the freelancer who was treated this way by the police. But this is the same newspaper that has editorialized that Julian Assange is not a journalist, that he is a despicable individual who doesn't deserve anything more than their contempt. And I believe that these cases are strikingly similar, and that we really need to see the media find its balls and recognize that it has to fight for the right to publish and the right to preserve confidential sources. And with Trump authorizing his personal attorney general to now investigate the investigations of 2016, I think that there are a lot of people who leaked Russiagate materials to mainstream media outlets are going to get a little nervous because the trend line could ultimately reach them. And I'm thinking of John Brennan and James Clapper. And we could see a prosecution of them and the people they leaked to under these expansive claims that have now been applied to WikiLeaks and the prosecution of Assange.
So, as the resident Maddow watcher, fortunate to have you on, because this is an unbelievable development for her to suddenly be changing her tune, in a completely different key here, because she's now supporting Assange and saying he's a journalist. How important do you think is that in terms of public support for Assange, particularly obviously amongst Democrats and amongst Democratic politicians? Chris Hedges was just saying he didn't think it would be all that important, where I'm hoping that it is. I think she's chief propagandist of the Democratic National Committee. So what role does her change here have, and how stunned were you by it, by the way?
Well, I was stunned, and it was a one-punch, because your own work has involved a lot of what we call foreign reporting. And what was striking is after Maddow took her stand holding her nose, but still strongly supporting Assange in view of the indictments based on the Espionage Act. She just transitioned to a report about what's going on in Britain and the European Union vote this weekend. She spent 4 minutes talking about Austria, had to tie it to Putin, of course, but this is the first international reporting that I've seen on her program in years. And so it's an interesting pivot. She no longer is wall-to-wall Russiagate. Chloe, can you quiet down? Sorry, I got some dogs here.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Well, I was going to interrupt if it took a minute with the dog, just to say that the Washington Post actually just published an article stating that some prosecutors involved with the Assange investigation have come out to say that they were against charging Assange under the Espionage Act. So just some breaking news to kind of update everyone with. So,
yeah, thank you.
But please continue, though.
Well, Maddows and Katie Johnstone, where are my papers here? She did a great job in a second piece. She wrote one about the indictments, and then she wrote a piece that I saw at Medium. And, you know, she describes herself as gobsmacked. Her headline is "Professional Assange Smearers Finally Realize His Fate is Tied to Theirs." And so, Joe, to your question, I guess I differ with Mr. Hedges just a little bit, with no lack of respect. But I think that there is a kind of trend here where the corporate media is finally recognizing that they are directly at risk. And it is that self-interest which is driving their belated embrace of principle. And perhaps their lawyers had a word with the editors and said, you know, they're indicting Assange for what we do all the time. And while what I described may seem far-fetched about, John Brennan and Jimmy Clapper facing some sort of ultimate prosecution for likely being the source of leaks related to Russiagate, we don't know where this ends. And Trump, you know, in one sense, is starting a backfire. In wildfires, you know, you sometimes dig a ditch and try to burn it out, so when the fire gets there, it's got no fuel to continue with. And, you know, Trump is facing the effort by the Democrats to hold him to account through lawsuits, but short of impeachment. He seems to really want impeachment. He thinks that will be a badge of honor that will work to his benefit in the 2020 elections. I think that's an open question. It is certainly a possible scenario. But I do think that the corporate media recognizes that it's got to man the barricades and really stand up and fight. So again, they're going to be squishy about Assange because they have many ways of wiggling out of direct support for him and his rights. The most ludicrous editorial comment that I saw today was at The Guardian, where they say, oh, just send him to Sweden. And, ultimately, Sweden could handle whatever those sex charges are and allow him to be extradited to the United States anyway. So, in general, I think that this is causing a whole recalculation. And I think that ultimately that's good for us in the independent media.
Absolutely there. As Elizabeth pointed out, by the way, even if Sweden wants to extradite him to the U.S., Britain has to sign off on it. So they can't completely wash their hands of this effect. But Peter, to me, this indictment went right. The Obama administration went right to the edge and would not do it because they knew it would criminalize journalism, much as they wanted to stop Assange. Trump has gone over the line. This has pulled down, I think, one more maybe one of the last pretenses of democracy that we have. They don't arresting him and now indicting him on these charges, which essentially are charges of doing journalism. The indictment really does say that a man had legal access to this material, and the language actually says that Assange was trying to help hide her identity so that investigators couldn't find out who did it. So they're admitting that he was practicing journalism. Where do you see this in terms of creating the backlash for the last hope we might have to try to restore a sense of democracy and a free press here, to stand up against this indictment, that if it hadn't happened, we could lull ourselves end of our freedoms. Now there's this a demarcation that is so strong historically that now this incredible Washington Post was just saying, the meeting here, that these prosecutors did not want Assange to be charged under the Espionage Act. And not only did they not want that, they've leaked it to the Washington Post. They want the world to know that. This is unbelievable events here. How does this figure in, Peter, in your ideas of where our democracy stands, this indictment?
Well, Joe, it's difficult. There's so much around partisan activities. So, for example, to get back to zero, in terms of trying to have a fundamental, democracy sometimes seems to be a stretch for what the American system represents today. But in order to recover, we have to unravel so much. And the Democrats are still committed to the false reporting in the Mueller report of the sweeping effort by Russia to meddle in our elections. And they're not going to give that up. And Trump equally, as you know, I'm a skeptic of the whole package. And Mueller didn't talk to Julian Assange. He didn't talk to Bill Binney. He left many threads, including the financial threads, untouched. And the biggest one to me was the operation in Britain with Stefan Halper and the trap that may have been set for George Papadopoulos. And so we have these fairly compelling, parallel but contradictory narratives. And we have so many people brainwashed to believe their version of these events that I'm not sure that we can really recover from this short term.
Yeah, I could just jump in. I agree with what Peter is saying, because if you read the comments to that New York Times editorial, that wishy-washy New York Times editorial that kind of said, terrible person Julian Assange is, but there's First Amendment issues involved. If you read those comments, they are all extremely hostile to Julian Assange. It's pretty much saying, yeah, he's getting what he deserves. He's a Russian agent. He was basically used by the Russians to destroy Hillary Clinton, to put Trump into power. That's the thrust of those comments to that editorial. So there's been so much poison introduced into the US system, it's going to be very hard to get out of it. That's why I'm not sure that I entirely agree with you, Joe, that the media will now be taking up the banner of the First Amendment and defending Julian Assange. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, yes, we have this weekend that they're suing it. By next week, we'll be back to Russiagate. We'll be back to the Assange-Russia connection. We'll be back to the plot that involved Russia, Trump, and Assange to do in Hillary Clinton. We'll be back to all the negative stories. He didn't look after his kitten and whatever. I don't think that this is going to continue. There's a momentary panic that's obviously taken hold this weekend. But I think by next week, we'll be back with the main story that Assange is a terrible person, and he was basically working for Putin to put Trump into power. And I think the media is running with that next week.
Well, I hope you're wrong, George. and I hope I'm right. And following what Peter said, we might see, if we see indictments, let's say, or an illegal effort to go after Brennan and Clapper, and even Comey for leaking classified information or for whatever, I would have no problem with that. But if they go over to then trying to indict reporters who reported that, even though I disagreed with them doing that, they're just being stenographers, I would totally disagree with that. So that's where the line is drawn. So if we see Trump going not after these officials, but then the press as well, we got a huge problem here. And if that happens, you're going to see the press really standing up for Assange, or at least the principle that this indictment cannot stand because it is allowing those other prosecutions of other journalists. So I think that's why I think you're wrong. I think this is not going to be just a one-off moment of panic by Maddow and all that.
Let's go back to what happened under the Obama administration. Now, the Obama administration, they wiretapped those AP reporters. They went after James Rosen. I don't remember there was a huge uproar in the media about that. I mean, there was a little bit, but not too much. So Obama did a lot of, going after the reporters. Not too much response from the media that was only too sympathetic to Obama.
Well, there's a big difference between wiretapping a reporter and indicting them under the Espionage Act, George. Huge difference.
No, I agree with you there. But this is something we talked about before. What would have happened had Julian Assange walked out of the Ecuador embassy during the Obama years? Would Obama really have said, okay, adios, amigo, off you go, we're not going to hold you? I don't think so. I think they would have rushed an indictment out and they would have done the same thing. They would have immediately pressured the British to hold him pending further charges. I don't think they would have just let him walk out.
Well, it's an excellent question that we'll never have the answer to, unfortunately.
Well, I'd like to add here that James Risen at The Intercept today apparently has ended his slumber and kind of the stupor of Russiagate, because he has a very strong piece in support of freedom of the press and the right to protect confidential sources. And I do acknowledge that he stood his ground in the Jeffrey Sterling case and refused to testify. But his embrace of the Russiagate narrative and vilification of Assange in the interim is, well, it's malodorous and still present.
Let me tell you something. I worked a quarter of a century in corporate media, and the herd instinct is so strong there. They're copycats. They're all going to jump on now here. Rachel maybe opened the way. So now Risen is coming on board. But they also see their own self-interest. That's what this is about. They see their own butts are on the line here. And they hate Trump to begin with. And they hate him now more than they hate Assange. And that's good news for the cause of freedom of the press.
Well, I want to make one comment related to the herd, Joe, because yesterday, John Philip Walker Lind was released from the federal prison in Terre Haute.
No kidding.
And I've interviewed his father. I've interviewed the imam at the mosque where he converted to Islam. I believe I know his story pretty well. And the smears that launched initially in the Washington Post and were continued by other media outlets in advance of his release supported Trump and Senator Shelby and the family of Mike Spann in their effort to rewrite the law and rewrite the events to extend his incarceration. Now, they failed, but the media coverage, with one exception, has been terrible. And the herd has been following the lead of the Post in declaring that, he was a Taliban believer, he's an extremist. And, the fact is that Lind was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had nothing to do with the death of Mike Spann. He was locked up in the basement of this fortress at the time that the skirmish erupted and that Spann was killed. And there is an op-ed that is in the Times today under the byline of a guy named Ray, W-R-A-Y, who I'm not familiar with, but he did a very good job, John Ray is his name, of bringing out the real facts of the case. Now that's buried on the op-ed page. The news columns continue to make out Lind to be a dedicated terrorist who is still a threat today. And while I don't